Okay, hey everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my TED Talk and welcome. So most of the TED Talks that we've been seeing here have been trying to convince you of some new idea or just trying to tell you about something new, and I'm not going to do all that. I'm telling a story today because everyone loves a good story. And this story is going to be surrounding a question, that question being, how did the reunification of Berlin and the lingering influence of East German cultural policies influence the rise of techno music, specifically in Berlin? So in order to answer this question, we need to talk about East German cultural policies. And I'm just going to start from the beginning. So for this, we have the problem of East German national identity. When East Germany was created, they didn't really have anything which differentiated them from the West. They'd been more or less the same country for the last 200 years. And so when the East German government, the SED, the Sozialistische Einheitspartei Deutschland, or Socialist Unity Party, realized that they couldn't outcompete the West economically, they decided to pursue cultural means. And so they looked towards more traditional forms of music in order to establish this. Beethoven and Bach were held as sort of national treasures. Classical music was at the center of German culture and had been for the better part of 2 centuries. Germans were the people of music. They decided to bolster this because of the, well, essentially they wanted to create a high-class socialist society where they took back high culture from the bourgeoisie and gave it into the hands of the workers. A way in which they did this directly was that they created so-called friendship contracts between professional artist organizations and factories, where they would send members of these organizations into the factories to help the workers in their creative endeavors, which was then meant to sort of create this identity of high class. Another way in which they tried to do this was through socialist realism, which was a doctrine that was introduced by the Russians, which basically encouraged artists to create positive imagery of socialist utopian life. In East Germany, the introduction of socialist realism meant creating culture around already existing mediums such as folk and classical, and in that the rejection of more modern principles such as experimental pitch organization, abandonment of tonal harmony, and complex irregular rhythms. Artists who did wish to adapt these sort of concepts were often accused of formalism, and in the case of East German musician Paul Hindemith, he was even denounced. And musicologist Karl Laux said that there no longer was an East German composer Paul Hindemith. Ultimately, these concepts were rejected because they were seen as far too complex for the general public and inadequate for relaying the socialist message. Thus, East Germany created a very unique sound in that it favored audience accessibility, whereas the West favored incomprehensible tonal compositions. Another example where we can see this socialist ideology shining through culture was within East German jazz. Jazz, for both communists in East and West, served as a vehicle to propagate ideas, as a voice of the oppressed, and as something that was internationally popular. It transcended the barriers of race, class, and national identity. When Louis Armstrong came to the East in 1965, he was hailed as a hero, as someone fighting for African American liberation and for the class struggle, the Klassenkampf. Whereas in the West, we saw him as, a jazz musician. It's there where we can kind of see how the East German government tried to push socialism into the general culture. It was during this time when the East German government pushed ever more isolationist policies, whereas before the 1960s, they kind of wanted to reunite Germany as a socialist state. It was also during this time when they decided that they wanted to establish jazz at the cultural center. They did this by subsidizing the lives of jazz musicians, their tours, and they created more workshops for people to further understand jazz. It was also during this time when rock entered East Germany from the West. It was initially rejected by the government as something that would lead people away from the path of socialism, but eventually the government had to concede, and so they aimed to create so-called socialist youth dance music, which failed because the only thing differentiating it from Western rock was its German lyrics, which have been described to have sounded like fig leaf comparatively. That's something. So the blues stayed in its Western form, and the significance was that the blues, the lyrics were about, you know, oppression experienced by people in the West, and it really resonated with the people in the East, in their own oppression, in their fight for liberation. And so the first real anti-establishment movement was formed out of the blues, called the Bluesers, which were basically the Eastern equivalent of the hippies in the US. They would basically travel from blues concert to blues concert, and they didn't really have as great of an impact as they could have had because they were extremely surveilled by the Stasi, the Ministry for State Security, and so many of the members were subsequently arrested. What followed the Bluesers were the East German punks, who had a much greater impact as an anti-establishment movement, mainly because their symbolisms. Their symbolisms were very broad. They basically just pulled anything out of mainstream culture and appropriated it in bad taste. And the punks were a very diverse group, you could say, and so it was hard for the Ministry for State Security to persecute them because the symbolisms had varied meanings from group to group. The lyrics within punk were very anti-establishment. Most of the bands sung about overthrowing the East German government, and subsequently many of the punk bands died the day of reunification because they had nothing else to sing about. What was also so significant about the punks, other than their music, was their stylistic expressions. They favored individual expression over political engagement, because in East Germany that was such a radical idea, because you grew up in this sort of social-based society where it was inappropriate to express yourself. And so when they went out onto the street with these styles, you had regular people seeing that and understanding that there is something outside of socialist life. And so the punks really, they didn't make the wall fall, but they did put the first cracks in it in some ways. This brings me to the peaceful revolution, or Die Wende, in East Germany, which happened pretty much during 1989. It started with, a accumulation of factors, but one being economic. East Germany's industries were rapidly declining during this time, so they had to import goods from the West, which were attached to high tariffs. And they had to take out loans from the West as well, which was highly controversial. They were also the most polluting country in Europe, because they didn't have the means for environmental sustainability, so this created civil unrest. That being the other factor was civil unrest. In August 1989, Monday Mass in the Evangelical Church in Leipzig turned into weekly Monday demonstrations. This was followed by the slogan, Wir sind das Volk, we are the people, slogan calling for democracy. It's here where I should note that the protests were originally not in favor of reunification, but actually in favor of more democratic reform. But the slogan was then later turned into Wir sind ein Volk, we are one people, calling for reunification. After September 11th, 1989, where protests in Leipzig were brutally repressed, weekly protests were held in Rostock. And then on the day of decision, October 9th, 70,000 protesters showed up in Leipzig to protest the government, a move which was not pushed back on by the police because of the overwhelming amount of people, which was unexpected. And it was also broadcast on TV, which wasn't planned, and it showed the East German people that they could now go out and protest. This was followed by a demonstration on Berlin's Alexanderplatz, which we can see right there. where 500,000 to 1 million people showed up to protest the regime. And then subsequently on November 9th, Günther Schabowski, in a press conference, announced a bill saying that people are now free to travel from east to west. He failed to address some key points, but by that point, the first people had already traveled over. It was after this time when techno music started becoming increasingly popular in Berlin. And I think before we start talking about techno music in Berlin, it's important that we talk about some history of techno music. Techno music came from house. It started with a guy, this guy right here. His name's Frankie Knuckles, and he's been coined the godfather of house. He was a warehouse, or he was a resident DJ in the club Warehouse in Chicago, and he started by playing predominantly disco records, but when electronic company Roland came out with their first of its kind drum machine in 1980, he decided to mix disco with drum beats, which I have an example of right here, where we have Let Yourself Go, a disco record. Play.
I turned off the volume, so you have to click on the computer.
And then we have Frankie Knuckles' version of that, where, I mean, we can see the influence. It's basically just sped up and he had some drums. So it's pretty simple, but it was very new at the time and a very new idea. House music is an abbreviation of Warehouse, where Frankie Knuckles played, just a fun fact. Techno came from the Belleville Three, which are comprised of Ewan Atkins, Derek May, and Kevin Sunderson, which are in that picture right there. They met at Belleville High School near Detroit, where they bonded over their love for the bands Parliament, the B-52s, and Kraftwerk. Ewan was the one who first bought a synthesizer and then taught his friends how to use synthesizer and decks, and he is credited with having created the first techno track ever, where he basically mixed he was inspired by this Frankie Knuckles house sound and Kraftwerk, and the song is called No UFOs. Where it's like, you know, it's very rhythmic. The sound clearly developed so much since then, but let's get that one. But it really resonated with people in Berlin. And so during the time of revolution, you had this, like, you know, incredible atmosphere created by the revolution. You had so much space available in the East now, since they were reunified. The authorities had better things to do than to shut down house parties, and then there was no longer a curfew. And so people were able to just go out and dance out their liberation, essentially, in illegal parties. But the first real established club was Tresor, which we can see right there, founded by Dimitri Hegemann. And it was the first real techno club, and it was revolutionary in a way that it was just so different. I have a video here of what it was like. You can see, I mean, it was dark, it was grimy, it was gross, but people really liked it. It had these like 2-meter thick walls that would just reverberate sound back into the dance floor, and like, you know, speakers would break because some joints were like blown up because it was just way too loud, and people loved it. And it really built, here's a video of like people actually. it's like, it's significant because like, it built a sense of community in Berlin. And you had people from both East and West coming into this club and connecting with each other on an even ground where they could just coexist in a space where you have all these stereotypes against each other, and you've been a disconnected nation for the better part of 25 years or 40 years. Yeah. Well, essentially, where am I going with this? Tresol was just like, it built community in Berlin. And the significance for the kids from the East especially was that they were able to come into the space and feel welcomed, yes, but they had also never experienced anything like this. And they brought this sort of punk culture over, this anti-establishment culture, and they brought it into techno. And so techno became this very, against the norm thing. And that's sort of where the eastern part is significant. Either way. Thank you.